All right, thank you, Tom. And I'll jump right into the questions, Kirk, if you will allow me. First of all, thank you all for being here. I met Kirk a few weeks ago at one of the symposiums that we had at the School of Business. And we got talking about some of his background. And he told me how he was an astrophysicist who has worked for NASA and whatnot. And I felt like maybe that is the reason why he is a good data scientist, and perhaps there is no hope for the audience here who have not gone through the physics degree. But I wanted to ask you, I was very intrigued by your story about how you came about and started doing data science. So it would be great to hear some of your background on and how you got into this field, and how was that migration from doing some real stuff in astrophysics and physics for NASA and now doing something which is in data science and machine learning and things of that type.
All right, great. Well, thank you, Anuj, and thank you all for being here today. I don't know if I'm echoing too much here, but the story really begins very early in my life, where I just became very curious about the world around us as a child, exploring interesting spaces. My father was U.S. Air Force, and we lived in sort of remote areas, and oftentimes I was finding myself in a desert climate or in a mountain range or somewhere like that. And as a child, just looking at the sky or looking in the ground, and so the curiosity that's natural to every single human being was in play there. And so I decided at a very early age I wanted to be an astronomer. So I pursued that and did that. So as a scientist in that field, it's like any other science field, you're always working with data. So I tell people that my night job was data as an astronomer. But my first job after grad school and a couple of postdocs, one of my postdoctoral fellowships actually was in DC at the Carnegie Institution of Washington, just up the road here. And so after a couple of those postdoctoral positions, I got to work at the Hubble Space Telescope. And then not only was my night job data, but my day job was data. So they actually put me in charge of a database. And then when I expanded that database work into an entire system that every astronomer in the world used for a few years in their uses of the Hubble Space Telescope. So I became sort of fluent in various languages, always working with data and databases. Like I said, as part of my day job, as also part of my night job. From there, I moved on to being the Hubble Archive Data Project Scientist for NASA, where we basically overlooked sort of the development of this state-of-the-art science data system for science use around the world. Focused a lot on user experience and design thinking, a lot of the things that are now natural to data scientists. Think about who is going to use this stuff and how can you make it usable to them. And I went from there to a management position at NASA Goddard Space Flight Center right around the Beltway. So during those years, always working with data. So my management position at NASA was at the National Space Science Data Center. And we were curating experiments, data from experiments in space science. And at that point, this was 20 years ago, 20-something years ago, we were managing 15,000 experiments of data. So every NASA experiment, whether it's a big one like Hubble or a little teeny sensor that bolted onto the side of a spacecraft, collects data. The PIs at some university, when they're finished with their project, the data comes back to NASA to be preserved for all time in this digital library called the National Space Science Data Center. So Congress mandated, hey, taxpayer, you, me, us, we paid for this data. So we had to curate it and maintain it and make it usable and useful to the world. So about 20 years ago, I remember pretty well, 1997, a colleague of mine met me at a conference and said, hey, my project is finishing. We want to turn our data over to the data center. Can we do that? And so he was telling me about it. I mean, I knew about the project, but I didn't know much about sort of their data per se. And he said, oh, yeah, it's 2 terabytes. Well, 2 terabytes today is pretty trivial, right? You probably have it on your thumb drive or something like that. Certainly in the cloud on your iPhone, you got at least 2 terabytes, right? But 20-something years ago, 2 terabytes was enormous. And so I knew it was enormous, but I didn't realize how enormous it was until I went back to the management team at the Space Science Data Center after this conference and said, hey, we got this opportunity to bring in these 2 terabytes of data from this particular experiment. And they looked at me like, you're missing something here, Kirk. And I'm saying, well, what am I missing? And he said, you realize we have 15,000 experiments of data archived here. I said, yes. And the sum total, cumulative, combined of all those 15,000 experiments is less than 1 terabyte. And you want to bring in 15,000, number one, after that, which by itself would require tripling the capacity of the data center. So at that point, I didn't know what to do. So a friend of mine said, look, why don't we put together a proposal to get some funding to build out the infrastructure to take in this data? And I said, how do you write a proposal for infrastructure? I'm an astrophysicist. I know about galaxies and black holes and things like that. I don't know about infrastructure. And so he said, well, why don't you look into data mining? And I said, that's a curious combination of two words, data and mining. So in 1997, I got into looking into what that was, and I discovered this field called machine learning. And having been a physicist, I had 1,000 semesters of math, roughly, and I had no problem with the math. But this was completely different from what I'd seen before. Actually discovering patterns and anomalies and interesting features in data. And then I said, this is really interesting. So I started digging further and discovered that not only was this true in the sciences that people had lots of data, but also across the world in healthcare and national security, and energy sector and health, precision medicine, things like this. There was just data everywhere. And so that's essentially how I sort of just fell in love with the concept of doing discovery from data. And I would say sort of the birth of the data scientist in me. It might have been when I was 9 years old, years ago, collecting data about the universe, but in terms of what we would now call data science with that machine learning piece was about 20 years ago. And anyway, so that's how I got to that point in my life, and I won't tell you all the rest of the story since then.